We are looking right now, watching in real time, the destruction of the modern family in the West. It's not hard to see. The rates of all of the things we don't want to see are going up. Divorce, children being born outside of marriage for the first time as a country is now above 50%. We're seeing huge growth in the areas of depression, anxiety, and people of all ages. Marriage has become, if anything, simply about self-fulfillment. And as people are seeking that self-fulfillment in marriage, they're finding that they can't find it. And so they simply leave. Marriage in our country and in our culture, and Western culture in general, is in shambles. Children's happiness has never been more focused on in history than it has been right now. Everything is about the children. Making sure they're happy, making sure that they are self-fulfilled, that their self-esteem is where it should be, and at the same time we're seeing the highest rates of depression amongst teenagers ever. Now we might talk about those statistics, what they really show, what they mean, but what is obvious is that there are a lot of problems in the family. Why is that? Well, the simple answer is the fall of the modern family began with a rejection of God being central in the home. Even amongst those who wouldn't call themselves Christians, we saw in the early parts of the last century a very clear focus on God even in the home. We were just talking, Lyle and I, last week about watching some old TV shows like the Fess Parker, Daniel Boone show in the 50s and 60s, and how as part of regular TV programming they were praying in the home, mentioning Jesus as part of the TV show. And how now there's nothing like that. There is a very clear line drawn from the further and further away that our culture moves from God, the more and more our culture is falling apart, starting in the home. And Malachi is addressing that very issue. We'll see this morning. We've been going through the last several weeks the book of Malachi. It's a short book right at the end of the Old Testament. And it's a message to the people of Israel, the Jewish people. They had returned from exile, having been sent into exile because of, ultimately, their rejection of God, turning away from God into foreign gods, trusting in themselves, trusting in their own might, and rejecting God. And true to his word, true to his warnings in the book of Deuteronomy, at the beginning of the people of Israel as God's people, God said, when you reject me, I'll reject you. And so he sent them into exile. But also true to his word, he had called them back. And the people had been reestablished in the land, and Jerusalem had been rebuilt, and the temple had been rebuilt, and the worship of God had started anew. And in the book of Malachi, what we see is likely a generation or so later. As the people had first experienced that revival, now there's a spiritual apathy that had grown amongst the people. And it began to bring in the same problems that they were facing before their exile. And so Malachi is calling them back to the truth, calling them back to God's word, calling them back to God. In chapter 1, in the first part of Malachi chapter 2, he focused on the problem start, and that is the priests. As we looked at last time we were here in the book of Malachi, as go the priests, so go the people. And so Malachi begins with the ones who are supposed to be focused on God the most, the ones who are supposed to be directing the people's focus to God, the ones who are supposed to be representing God to the people. And they are the ones who seem to be most frustrated with God, bringing to him empty, worthless offerings. And what we saw in that is our offerings' value to us demonstrates how much we value God. And so when we bring broken and worthless, empty offerings, it shows that's all we care about God. It shows the value, how much we value our worship, shows how much we value God. And as the priests seemed not to care, so the people followed. This morning we're looking at the first address to the people in general. In chapter 2, starting in verse 10 down to verse 16, which is our passage for this morning, Malachi is calling out the covenant unfaithfulness of the people, focusing on the family and how it was beginning to fall apart. Let's read our passage for this morning, Malachi chapter 2, verses 10 to 16. Do we not all have one Father? Has not one God created us? Why do we deal treacherously each against his brother, so as to profane the covenant of our fathers? Judah has dealt treacherously, and an abomination has been committed in Israel and in Jerusalem, for Judah has profaned the sanctuary of the Lord, which he loves, and has married the daughters of a foreign god. As for the man who does this, may the Lord cut off from the tents of Jacob everyone who awakes and answers, or who presents an offering to the Lord of hosts. This is another thing you do. You cover the altar of the Lord with tears and with weeping and with groaning, because he no longer regards the offering or accepts it with favor from your hand. Yet you say, for what reason? Because the Lord has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth, against whom you have dealt treacherously, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. But not one has done so who has a remnant of the Spirit. And what did that one do while he was seeking a godly offspring? Take heed then to your spirit, and let no one deal treacherously against the wife of your youth. For I hate divorce, says the Lord, the God of Israel, and him who covers his garment with wrong, says the Lord of hosts. So take heed to your spirit, that you do not deal treacherously. Now, if you were reading along in your own Bible, you may have noticed some very different structure to, especially verses 15 and 16. We'll get into that. There is a lot of interpretational difficulty in those verses. Again, we'll get to that in time. But the focus of the passage, the focus here this morning, comes down to this idea that the rejection of God and his covenant leads to the breakdown of the family. The picture that Malachi uses is the family. And we see that in several places, referring to brothers dealing treacherously with one another. The rejection of God by marrying the daughters of a foreign god. Foreign women who have different beliefs, bringing in idolatry. And the breakdown of the most basic family relationship, that of husband and wife. He begins with this idea of covenant family. Do we not all have one Father? Now, it's important to recognize here that Malachi is speaking to the people Israel. This is not the idea that all people who are created are God's children, though that's often used and very much misused in our culture today. Malachi is focused on the people of Israel. When he says, has not God created us, he is referencing Israel as a nation, his chosen son. Now, yes, we are all created in God's image. We are all image bearers of God. But Jesus himself made it clear that those who are not amongst the people of God are the children not of God but of the devil. So we need to recognize, again, Malachi is speaking to the Israelites, the Jewish people, not everyone in the world. But we can understand this as applying to ourselves as well, because we are God's adopted children. And there is a lot in that family motif that we don't have time to go into this morning, but this is the picture Malachi is painting, that of the family. The covenant family of God. In chapter 1, verse 6, he had already brought that father-son example in, recognizing that God treats his children as a father treats them. And there should be respect, as Malachi points out. In verse 6, God says, a son honors his father. Then if I am a father, where is my honor? So we see this family motif. Now we see also multiple times through this passage this idea of dealing treacherously. Or if you have the ESV, it might say being faithless. Or the NIV says being unfaithful. This is the Hebrew word baghdad. It's used multiple times throughout this passage. There isn't actually too many times that it's used throughout the Old Testament. And a lot of them come right here. And it has this idea of being faithless, to break faith, to break trust. One author described the word this way. He said the word describes either a violation of a covenant or an act of betrayal or treachery in a relationship that calls for loyalty, kindness, and service. This word is only used in the most intimate of relationships where there is a betrayal, that covenant promise. The covenant being the promise of closeness, the contract, as it were. The covenant of God and his people. The covenant of marriage. The family bonds that exist. And this is a breaking of faith, a treachery, a betrayal in that closest of relationships. It's the picture of the breaking apart of a family because of unfaithfulness, of treachery, betrayal. Brother against brother. Child against father. Husband against wife. The betrayal of those closest to you. Family, God, and spouse. And that's what we see in this passage. 3 betrayals. 3 acts of unfaithfulness. The first is that the unfaithfulness to brothers, or the family. Unfaithfulness within the covenant people. In verse 10, he says, why do we deal treacherously, each against his brother? That's the focus of the verse there. The focus of the statement, that betrayal. Of people turning against each other, neighbors turning against each other, dealing treacherously, being unfaithful, cheating, swindling. The breakdown of community, especially heinous, is this breakdown of the family of God. The people of Israel turning against one another. The next betrayal is that of God himself. An unfaithfulness to God in verse 11. Judah has dealt treacherously. An abomination has been committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. At the very heart of the people in Jerusalem, Judah has profaned the sanctuary of the Lord. The very heart of the people's relationship with God, the sanctuary, the holy place, the temple, God is saying, has been profaned. How? For this is a reference to all of Israel, all of Jerusalem, this is happening in the culture, has married the daughter of a foreign god. Now, this is a direct statement against the men who are marrying these women, but it begins with this, the betrayal of God. That this is allowed. Why is this a problem? God is not a racist. God is not separating out people because of those lines, but the point that he's making in marrying the daughter of a foreign god, this is a woman who is an idolater. A woman who is outside of the family of God. What is the problem? By bringing in a foreign wife, by bringing in a woman who worships these other gods, you are bringing the worship of other gods into the family. Into the very family of God. Into the home. And ultimately into the sanctuary of God. Bringing the worship of other gods into the home creates conflict and strife. It splits loyalty, where there should be harmony. There should be unity. It creates a conflict, loyalty to one's wife or loyalty to God. And eventually something has to go. Either the marriage or one of the gods. And more often than not, it was the true God that gets rejected for idols. In order to keep peace within the home. That's the reason why God forbid the Israelites to marry outside of the people of Israel to begin with. It's not because he was trying to create some wall of separation between Israel and everybody else, because only Israel can be saved and only this. No. God always meant for the gospel, God always meant for his kingdom to extend to all the world. But the people of Israel needed first to be separated so that they could be a light to the world around them. To be holy, to be put apart. And when the people started mixing with those around, they brought in the worship of other gods, just like the rest of the world did. And it creates problems. It ruins the image of the people of God as someone who is separate, but it ruins the home as well. This is the reason why God forbids being unequally yoked. Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 says this very clearly. He says, "Do not be bound together, yoked together with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? Or what harmony has Christ with Belial? Or what has a believer in common with an unbeliever? Or what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God." What is his point? To be bound together with an unbeliever creates unending strife. The picture there is being yoked. So think of two animals pulling a plow or pulling a wagon. And this is not just two similar animals that may be slightly different stature. One ox is a little bit stronger than the other. No, these are two separate animals. This is an ox and a donkey. This is trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. This just doesn't work. And if you try to do that with two animals like that, two very different animals, what you're going to end up with is a whole lot of headache. And that's the warning. First, this relationship pulls us away from God as it splits loyalties. And as with any sin, it creates conflict. This is a warning to you young people, those of you who are not married. Don't look for a spouse outside of the family of God. No missionary dating, as it's sometimes called. This is where someone says, well, this person is wonderful. They may not be a Christian, but we'll date for a while and I'll get them to come to church with me and I'll preach the gospel to them while we're dating. It's a very bad idea. It may work sometimes, to be sure. But why put yourself in that risk? This is, I think, more common amongst girls. There's that boy that's very cute. He has the right characteristics you want, but he just needs to be fixed. You can't fix him. Only Christ can. And don't put yourself through that. The most important thing that anyone should be looking for in a spouse is their commitment to Christ. Everything else is a distant second. Looks, money, compatibility. All of those things will fall into line when God is first in your life. And first in your spouse's or your future spouse's life. Ultimately, all marriage counseling comes down to the problem of sin. Putting something other than God first in the marriage. This goes both ways. I know CJ could tell you about many difficult counseling sessions with women who are struggling with unbelieving husbands. Counseling together, we've counseled couples struggling with communication, with trust. Ultimately, it comes down not to compatibility, not to personality. It comes down to sin. Putting something other than God first. What happens when you find yourself in this position, being unequally yoked? A believer married to an unbeliever? Well, Paul deals with that in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. It is a difficult topic, a very difficult thing, which is why we're warned away from it from the beginning. Why we should never pursue it voluntarily. But again, that's a topic for another time. Marrying unbelieving spouse. These men marrying foreign women comes down first and foremost to them rejecting God, being unfaithful to God. Treachery against Him. Like the priests in the first section, the problem was not the fact that they were bringing blemished sacrifices. The problem was that they didn't care about God. They did not value God. And the same is true here. The problem is not these men marrying foreign women. That's simply an outgrowth. That is the result of them being unfaithful to God to begin with. And when that's the starting point, again, those marriages are simply going to fall apart. And that's the third accusation, the unfaithfulness to their wives. The wife of your youth is a Jewish way of saying your first wife, your original wife, the one that you married, when you were young and when you were first starting out, the only one that you should have been married to. This betrayal is, of course, tied into that rejection of God. And it brings in this whole idea of divorce. The men of Israel came to God, we see in verse 13, bringing their prayers, filled with tears, with weeping, with groaning, because God was rejecting their prayers. God was rejecting their sacrifices. Their lives were falling apart. And it seemed like God didn't care. Why? Why were their lives falling apart? Why would God not care? Because they had been unfaithful from the beginning, abandoning their wives for other women, let alone the fact that these were foreign women, women of other faiths, other gods. In verse 14, there is a very direct, very condemning statement. The Lord has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth. The reason why we have a marriage ceremony led by a pastor or representative of the church is because they are, in a sense, representing God. The same was true for the priests in the Old Testament. God is presiding over this covenant, these promises that are being made between husband and wife. God is the witness. And the oaths that are taken, the promises that are made before God, because He is the one that you're making them on. You're married before God. And when you reject that marriage, when a divorce comes in, what you're saying is, I don't care about God holding me to my word. Either He's powerless, or I reject Him as an authority figure in my life. Someone to hold me to my oath. God is a witness. God is the one who is condemning you because you made a promise to Him as much as you did to your spouse. And He's the one that's holding you to it now. In verse 15, there is this idea that no one who follows God, no one who follows His laws, His commands, who loves Him and respects Him would go this direction. And we see in verses 15 and 16 the clear command to stop this treachery, stop this unfaithfulness. And the focus is divorce there, because it's the worst betrayal in a human relationship. The statement in verse 15, I hate divorce. I'm sorry, verse 16, I hate divorce, is true in and of itself. God hates divorce because it is a rendering of something that He has brought together. But it goes beyond that. When we understand the context, we understand Malachi's point here. It's a reference to all of this covenant unfaithfulness. And the one who does this covers himself with violence like a cloak, like a garment. Putting on violence, putting on wrongdoing, putting on betrayal like a coat. Living in it. There is, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of difficulty interpreting those first verses 15 and 16. And so you may see a lot of differences depending on your translation there. The NASB, as I read from, says, but not one who has done so, this is divorcing his wife, has a remnant of the Spirit. No one who reflects the image of God would do this kind of thing. The ESV says it this way: did He not make them one with a portion of the Spirit in their union? And what was the one God seeking? Godly or righteous children. The NIV says it even differently. Has not the one God made you? You belong to Him in body and spirit. And what does the one God seek? Godly offspring. There is a lot of difficulty in this, and if you are interested, we can go into it later. I'm not going to go into all of the Hebrew here, but overall, understanding this comes down to one focus: covenant betrayal. And it begins because of a rejection of God. the marriage falls apart, the lack of godly offspring, the children who are struggling in disobedience, all of the problems that come in the home, that break apart the family, begin because of a rejection of God. Are there struggles in your home? Struggles in your family? Strife? Conflict? The problem is not the conflict. The problem is a lack of focus on God. That's where it begins. So, this morning I only have one question, and it's a simple one. Often the generic answer that is given to fix the problems of marriage and family, both for our culture and for individuals, is to tell people to go back to church. Is that the solution?
Depends on the church. Depends on your attitude of why you're going to church in the first place. If you're just checking the boxes and doing what looks good on the outside, no.
I think if you're going back to church so that your spouse or whatever can hear what they need, you know, and not going with the attitude of I need to hear, I need to be confronted with the truth. That's a problem too. So,
Going to church with a sharpened elbow.
yeah.
That's the idea there. Get in there waiting for it. Go ahead.
I mean, we've seen marriages implode within our church and even within our missionary community, which was surprising. So I don't think that's the answer. I think really a humble heart is what people need. It's not necessarily going to church that's going to give you that.
I think a solid church can provide a lot of support in those things. That's not the core answer. What you're saying. A heart that's humble and ready to change is the main thing. Yeah, being part of a good church can be a real help.
So what is the solution then?
Well, I wouldn't make a statement, an imperative statement of do this. I would ask the question. How's your relationship with God? How is your relationship with God? What God do you believe in? And what does that mean? How's that changing your life?
I couldn't hear some of the comments that were said over there, but I would say this, going back to church isn't the solution, but it most certainly is a step in the right direction. And, you know, one of the things you've heard me say before, and I'll continue to say it, our daughter didn't get married in the church. I don't think you have to get married in a church. You know,
In a church building.
but I look at weddings and I look at funerals. And as we move away from this building, by not attending and participating, I see that as a move in the wrong direction. And I say that because it's my own analysis of funerals that are, sometimes they're a memorial service in a bar. Sometimes, I don't know, just God is on from marriages and from funerals, and that's sad.
It is. And we're seeing such a degradation, just doesn't even seem like the right word, a collapse of the family. And as you mentioned, even within the church sometimes, just saying go to church isn't enough. We need that humility. We need, and I think Emily hit it right on the head, to ask the question, what's your relationship with God? what is the solution? It's not just getting somebody in church, because as we're looking at the Israelites here, they are going to church. They're going to the temple. They're presenting offerings with weeping and groaning. But what's the problem?
Malachi didn't tell the people to go back to the temple, did he? He asked the question, who is your God?
Mm-hmm.
And over, that was the question. Who is your God? And that's the question today. There's other gods. We don't, it isn't like a calf or something, but it's there. It's in us. And that's the real issue. When you have the wrong God, you chase after the wrong women. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just the thought, fixing the problems is, partly us being aware of what we're doing wrong, and the other part of it is forgiving other people when they do things wrong. And I was just thinking about the children's story, and, and then when Jesus said, if you remember that you sinned against your brother when you're, doing your sacrifice on the altar, stop what you're doing, go fix fix that relationship and then come back and worship. And just the idea that, why would you do that? Well, because of what God has done for us, the fact that He's forgiven us. And that, just knowing that we were forgiven when we didn't deserve it. And understanding that and being, like our response to that should be a willingness to forgive others, even if we don't think they deserve it. But just how that should change our heart. And so the idea, I think, is going back to what everyone's saying, is the relationship we have with God and our understanding of what He's done for us. If that doesn't affect us and how we treat others, then there's something wrong with our relationship with God if it doesn't change us. And so, yeah, I think that's definitely the right answer.
We need to recognize that going to church or the broken family, the broken marriage, these are symptoms of a much deeper problem. Just trying to fix it with what we can do, just going to church, isn't the answer. As Emily said, the question is, who is your God? As you said, the idea of what God are you worshiping? What is your focus? What's the solution? The solution is the gospel. The solution to the broken marriages, the broken families, the conflict is the gospel. Before you can even worry about fixing all of the little things, all of the symptoms, the little things like divorce and children who are going crazy, you got to fix the first thing. Who is your God? Who are you worshiping? You need the humility to come in and say, I need God. I need to be focused on Him. Then everything else can start to be fixed. And going to church needs to be an outgrowth of that. Not just a Band-Aid solution. Not just a list of check marks to try to fix those things. All right, we're going to close there, and I'll close us with a word of prayer.